So today we're going to be going over a few photos which would be nothing without the text. These photos are worth reading and it's what makes them worth talking about. Call it the context, if you will. Word on the street is these photos are worth a few words. Okay, sorry, I'm done with the puns. And well, if that all sounds a little strange to you, then you're probably new here. So if you are, go ahead and hit that sub button for me. Also, before we move forward, I want to quickly mention macintoshphoto.com, where you can find all sorts of prints and t-shirts, etc., photography related things. Go and check that out. Additionally, I'd like to add that all the context that I do give these photos is all just coming from me. It's not reflective of the subject that's in the photos, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Throughout this video, we will be talking about how you can use text in your own photography and how it can actually elevate the photo, and maybe how not to do it, how not to just throw it in there willy-nilly when it doesn't really add to the photograph. Now, I think the concept is pretty simple, so let's get into our first photo here. So this first photo is a street photograph, and it's of an advertisement billboard. The couple in the front there aren't actually part of the billboard, although because of their colors and maybe the tone, it actually looks like they could be a little bit part of the billboard. And I think also the framing that I chose to not really include anything outside of the advertisement. This is actually something I largely avoid when I'm doing street photography. I think it's one of the cliches of street photographs that you see really often, and 90% of the time that I see it, it's done quite poorly. And what I mean by that is that the billboard or advertisement often just doesn't really add to the photograph. There's a subject in front of an advertisement and there's no real cohesion between the two unless you make a big kind of mental stretch. But in this one, we have this text. This is the new generation, with a model of the advertisement sort of kicking towards the camera. You have this couple who look like they're of an older generation than the model in the advertisement. And I love this hand that's on the lower back of the man, where it sort of looked like he's being hurried along as if they're making way for the new generation. I love the motion of the people moving through, so it signifies to the viewer that they're moving out of the frame. I love where they have been framed in the photo. It doesn't block the text, it doesn't block too much of the model and the advertisement, and they're moving out to the right of the frame. So there's something that the eye does, and I think, for example, in Western cultures where we read from left to right, anything passing to the right is going out of the frame, and anything coming in from the left is sort of coming into the frame. So there's sort of a psychology there also in the direction that everything is moving. There's also this version in black and white, which I'll put here too, because I think it also works. Moving on, because we've got quite a lot to get through, but you with me? You get the idea? Pretty simple, right? All right, onward. Second photo, one of my favorite underrated photos of mine, Du har. What is important about that text? Well, first of all, it's the language. It tells you where you are. And in this photo, quite literally, the translation is "you are here." And here was Stockholm, Sweden, about 5 years ago. I love the silhouette of the hand, the text giving context. I love that you can see multiple people there, even though that there's so much black. You only have their silhouettes and a few details just to show that. Also, assuming that they're tourists. I think that tourists can be really hard to photograph and make it look good or interesting. So in that case, I think this is one of the ones where I really did that right. Also, by coincidence, one of my friends from Sweden, Isa, she used to photograph tourists quite a lot and she did really well. I don't know how much she does that anymore, but if you're watching, Isa, hello. So we have text, language, context. Helps the photo. Moving on. This one here, pretty self-explanatory. Stetson Hats and more. Gentleman looking through the window with a really nice hat on, or they're clearly browsing for another one. Not much else to say about this one. It's pretty self-explanatory. I love the way that the text bends over the subject there. The lighting's nice, the tones are nice, and I also really love this little hand gesture sitting behind the lower back here. And a little behind the scenes of this photo, he only paused in that window for about a second, and before that second, there was another person in the frame. And I specifically remember that that person's color palette wouldn't have fit the photo, they didn't have a hat on, they would have cluttered the photo. So if they had still been in the frame, this photo wouldn't be anywhere near worth what it is to me today. Next, two gentlemen walking down the waterfront who I'm going to assume are old friends. Also, another nice hat, by the way, potentially a Stetson. One thing I've alluded to in this channel is my love for graffiti, and I think there is a big correlation between street photography and graffiti. And whether you love it or hate it, it is a big part of the city, and as street photographers, we're supposed to be capturing the city. Now, just living in this city long enough, I am familiar with this tag. I've just lived here long enough to recognize it. Also, shouts out to Macier, who in my time in Helsinki was everywhere. But it's was that I want to focus on in this photo. There's something to me in my mind that tells the story of these two gentlemen. They're of an older age, they're taking a walk together, and maybe they're taking a trip down memory lane and talking about what was. Could be a little bit of a stretch, but in my mind, I'm very happy it's a part of this photograph. And I believe it makes it a little bit more worth its value. Next up, we head to Beijing, China, where we see this elderly gentleman taking a seat out on the street, which is pretty common to see there. He's got his wheelchair with him, he's got his cane, and he's looking pretty cool, to be honest. And on the opposite side of the alleyway, we have this tattoo studio. baby boom tattoo. And so I'll let you draw all the obvious connections between the gentleman here and the name of the tattoo studio. But I'd also like to point out the other connection with things like the history of tattooing and certain generations. Tattooing has been around a long time in China at this point. However, it is a very traditional country and not all generations agree with the idea of tattooing. So for me here, there's just a connection between old China and new China, not only with this gentleman in the frame here, but also with the architecture and everything you see around it. And it's something I always like to explore when entering a city, to not only capture what is always changing in a city, but also what has been preserved in its history and culture. Staying in Beijing, China, I also captured this photo there. I've talked about this photo at least more than once on this channel already before and its importance to me personally. However, I'd just like to point out again, specifically for this video, how much the text is important in this photo. Because this photo could essentially be taken anywhere in the world, but what is important is this tiny little piece of text that you have on the bus. The Chinese characters give us a pretty good idea on where this photo was taken, because I assume that most other countries that are not Chinese speaking are not going to have Chinese lettering written on the bus, which is a pretty good lesson. It doesn't actually need to be that much, like this is the new generation photo. It doesn't need to be that obvious, but just a hint of something can give so much contextual value to the photo. Next up, we have a street photo that I took in Italy. Now, I think this one's pretty self-explanatory, but let me point out one thing to you. Imagine if that word fragile was not on those boxes. This photo would instantly become far less interesting, because it could be anything in those boxes. It could be just packing peanuts for all I care. So as you see him struggling to push those boxes up and them spilling over, the words fragile give you the context that it's important that they don't hit the ground. And not much else to it. I'm sure you get it. Here we are with a little bit more of a difficult photo. We've got a gentleman here who's having a bit of a rough day with some public transport security and a couple of police officers. Now, I'm not going to make any assumptions on what's happening in this photo because, well, I don't know. But I have also had my own issues with the security that some of them just clearly want to go out and ruin your day for no reason. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume this was a complete misunderstanding. Otherwise, what I think we ended up here with is sort of this unintentional Renaissance photo, which if you're not familiar with, I think comes from a subreddit where things in real life just unintentionally look like Renaissance paintings. And of course, in this video today, we're talking about the text, which adds to the photo. And here we have these two words, life art, which again is something that you can just draw so many parallels to what's in the photo and also this text, that art imitates life and life imitates art, and also that the job of the street photographer is to turn what seems like everyday life into art. Otherwise, outside of that, I think there's some pretty obvious parallels that you might have already put together yourself. This image is one that I'm actually pretty proud of. I think it's a really strong image. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Here's an image that I took, which I think is a great example of how to use the text specifically to tell the story of your photo. I'm usually very subject heavy when I shoot street photography, but in this case, I think that the subject is potentially only 1/3 of the photo. I saw this text and I knew what I was going to do. And a big portion of the photo is that text, but also the technique I used to get it. It's a combination of using my skills as a photographer, knowing how to use my camera, getting just the right amount of motion blur, but not too much so that you can still read the text. And as far as a creative street photograph goes, I think it's a pretty nice one. And so as another tip, if you see a text that you like, take a second to think about it and ask yourself, what does this say? What does it say to me? And how am I able to use this in my photo specifically where it makes a point? In this photo, I'm moving, the subject is moving, and we have the text moving. It all comes full circle, and the text is imperative to this photo. Here's another graffiti related one, a very old photo of mine, which to be honest, when I took it, I didn't even think it was a great photo, but I figured to include it because of the text and the narrative that it gives me. Here we have this Mural character, almost looking like he's pointing towards the dark. He's got death spilling out of his mouth, as if to say, death is this way. And here we have our subject, full outfit, full kit, and full speed ahead into the darkness. The darkness, we have this sloping black shadow caused by this tunnel or overpass, with the obvious metaphor of death and the pitch black there as well. And I like to think our subject, who's fully prepared and hitting it with full speed, is sort of saying, you're not coming for me, I'm coming for you. That one's a little bit more of a stretch on my part, and it's my interpretation of this photo, but it's the whole reason why I took it in the first place. And again, serves as a good example that the text doesn't need to be so literal, but can also just help the metaphor that you have in your own head and inspire you to take the photo or share that story with others in the future. This next one here reads, liking who you are. And it's a photo that I took on the tram of someone reading a book. Now, I will say this photo is a little bit too close up, and I would have liked a little bit more context on where we were because it doesn't really feel like a street photo. However, I remember when I snapped it, I had a 50mm on the lens. I was getting off the tram, and by the time I took the photo, I was just already too close. I couldn't get a wider angle. However, I feel like it speaks very clearly to our current times and generations, to that of people who are in search of self-acceptance, and also to the fact that it's okay to ask that question now. It's okay to read that book in public. It's been accepted. accepted. So not only are we in this constant search of how to be fulfilled and how to accept ourselves, but that it's also been widely accepted that we're all kind of on the same page now, but also just that things like self-help, self-improvement, therapy are just accepted as things of common practice. Another one from the tram here, although one that's a little bit more difficult. We have this gentleman who looks like he's probably asleep on the tram, and to which I wouldn't think would be a photo I would take at all had it not been for the text. Here on this bag he has Scandinavian Sleeping and Living written. I think especially when I took this photo, there was a big conversation about how living in Scandinavia was like a standard for Europe or even the world. And now in more recent times, I think people are starting to see a little bit more of the rust under the paint. But I think it sparks a bit of an interesting conversation on what that really looks like from the inside and how Scandinavia is perceived by the rest of the world. And is maybe not impervious to other problems of the rest of the world, like some people might think it is. For this next photo, we go back to Italy where we find this gentleman sitting with who I presume is a young family member. In the background, we have this graffiti, "Still not hearting police." Seems to be a theme in this video. Italy also being a pretty conservative country when it comes to things like its history with tattoos. So you can maybe safely assume that this gentleman comes from somewhat of an alternative upbringing. Again, these are just my thoughts and not something that directly reflects from the subject personally. And again, we find ourselves exploring this generational gap. And at a time where things are maybe changing, and I like the word still in this graffiti, still not hearting police, as if potentially he wasn't back when he was younger and still isn't. Even though at this point he's maybe aged and has kids of his own. And on to our final photograph of this video here, and we move ourselves to France. Now, I was out photographing a pretty hectic demonstration when I came across this guy. Here in the background, you can see the protesters who have scaled this fountain. You see some face coverings and a number of flags, which suggests that there is a protest happening. And of course, the very ironic slogan on the gentleman's t-shirt here. And to me, what looks like a pretty ironic smirk on his face to match. I think it's a pretty interesting juxtaposition of the seriousness of this protest and also the facetiousness and the irony of the statement on the t-shirt there, making what I find to be another pretty funny street photograph. Finding comedy in street photographs is not something that's easy to do because it doesn't always present itself, but it's something I do like to include when I can find it. And again, text can help a lot. And so that's all for today's video. I hope that helped in some way and that the next time you go out to photograph, you might have a better idea on how maybe to include text in your photographs. Let me know if you enjoyed these photos and the context that I gave them, and maybe let me know in the comments if the text in these photos gave you a different narrative to the ones that I came up with. Thank you for watching, hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed the video, and until next time, peace.